Our second panel consists of advocates for victims of international human trafficking. Our speakers work directly with those most affected by this heinous trade and seek legal and social remedies on their behalf. I welcome our moderator, Nikita DeYoung, back to the podium to introduce the participants on our second panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. So let's just get right into it. As Annie mentioned, this session we're going to discuss international human trafficking. And to my immediate right, my immediate left, we have Ms. Susan Bailey. Ms. Bailey is an attorney and current director of the Women's Law Center of Maryland's Multi-Ethnic Domestic Violence Project, the Mondovi Project, which is a statewide program that provides pro bono immigration legal assistance to Maryland residents who are foreign-born victims of domestic violence, human sex trafficking, intimate partner stalking, or sexual assault. Some of her current and past commitments are the American Immigration Lawyers Association National Committee on T's, U's, and VAWA, Governor's Task Force on Human Trafficking Foreign National Subcommittee, and Human Trafficking Ambassador, Domestic Violence Coordinating Councils, and the Board of Directors of the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. Welcome, Ms. Bailey. Next, we have Morgan Weibel. Morgan Weibel is the Baltimore Director at the Tahirih Justice Center, a national nonprofit organization that protects courageous women and girls who refuse to be victims of gender-based violence. As an immigration attorney, Morgan represents women and girls in their applications for gender-based asylum, T visas for victims of human trafficking, U visas for victims of violent crimes, and in their Violence Against Women's Act petitions. She serves as the co-chair of the Victim Services Committee of the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force and as the American Immigration Lawyers Association Liaison Committee Chair to the Baltimore Immigration Court. Morgan is a graduate of the University of California Hastings College of Law and a Spanish speaker. Welcome, Ms. Weibel. And finally, we have Ms. Brooke Welch. Brooke Welch serves as pro bono coordinating attorney in the Baltimore office of Kids in Need of Defense. She values the opportunity to facilitate pro bono legal representation for immigrant children. Prior to joining KIND, Brooke practiced complex litigation for several years in leading law firms before transitioning her career to a nonprofit service as a staff attorney at the Esperanza Center Catholic Charities of Baltimore. At Esperanza, Brooke focused on humanitarian immigration remedies, including asylum, VAWA, U visa, and T visa. Brooke holds leadership positions with the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force and Maryland Immigrant Rights Coalition. In addition, she serves on the Baltimore City Police Commissioner's Hispanic Advocacy Council for Public Safety. In collaboration with the Baltimore City Mayor's Office and Hispanic Advisory Council, Brooke initiated and negotiated a successful project for renewal of the U visa law enforcement certification process in Baltimore City. As a result of these efforts, Brooke received a 2015 Maryland Governor's Victim Assistance Award as Outstanding Victim Services Professional. Brooke received her JD from the University of Virginia School of Law, a Master's of Art in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and a Bachelor of Arts in French from the University of Virginia. She provides legal services in English, Spanish, and French. Welcome, Ms. Welch. And now we would open the discussion. As I mentioned, this session is on international human trafficking. So if we can start by just describing to our audience what is international human trafficking and what the common victims of international human trafficking looks like.
I'll go ahead and start. No one's jumping up for that.
You're so good at it, though.
So I think for those of you that saw the previous panel, when Rachel explained that the federal definition of human trafficking does not require any transport across an international border, the same thing applies in what we're calling here today international trafficking cases, right? So the cases that we work on, it does not mean that any of our particular clients were brought here into the United States by a trafficker or taken across an international or state border in order to qualify for those services. Some of our clients may have legally entered the United States, so they might be here on a student visa, they may have had some other tourist visa, some other way to enter the United States, and then find themselves recruited and groomed by a trafficker and trafficked here. There are also cases where international trafficking survivors are brought over by their traffickers into the United States, but I just want to take a moment just to acknowledge that transportation across a border is not required. I think another thing that we commonly confuse with this term international trafficking is human smuggling, right? So some of the elements when we look at human smuggling is it's a voluntary act where you pay someone to take you across a border illegally. We do see cases where what starts out as human smuggling morphs into or converts into a trafficking situation. You might see someone who, for example, pays to be smuggled across a border and then is facing exorbitant debt or additional debt is added on and they become a labor trafficking victim or a sex trafficking victim. So the two can overlap, but there is smuggling and then there is human trafficking. The similar elements that Rachel mentioned in force, fraud, and coercion are part of the federal definition that are applied in the immigration context on the cases that we work in. I guess with the exception that I will say that we have been able to file, and I guess we'll go into the forms of relief later, but U visas under the Maryland definition of human trafficking that may not necessarily have those elements of proving force, fraud, and coercion. So that's kind of the one exception to it. What do internationally trafficked victims look like? I think they take all different shapes and forms. They come from all different countries. There's all different industries that you find survivors or victims in. One that we see a lot of at the Tahirih Justice Center are victims who have come over as nannies or au pairs or working as domestic servants, particularly with foreign national diplomats in some cases, World Bank employees, other international organizations, because in this region we're a hub for those international agencies. And so you can often see that particularly in the more affluent areas of Maryland, like Potomac, Maryland, for example. The other types of labor trafficking cases that we see are agricultural based for sure. Am I missing any others? I mean, there's a whole host. Basically, all of the examples that Rachel went down, certainly apply here. Laundromats, nail salons, massage parlors, and then
restaurants.
Right.
I was going to say, Amanda Rodriguez, who I believe was on the last panel, prior to her role at Turnaround and the governor's office, she was a prosecutor in Baltimore County, and she actually prosecuted several cases, I believe, involving nail salons, massage parlors in Baltimore County. So, it doesn't necessarily fit your, immediate idea of like someone flown in to be part of a sex trafficking scheme. These individuals, like Morgan said, come legally with a visa, but end up in a situation where there is forced labor or what we call debt bondage, where you have to keep paying back this amount of money that will never go away. So you are trapped.
So I just wanted to add with our clients, they have all been trafficked by persons in their own country. So I think like the World Bank employees and the diplomats that Morgan was referring to, a lot of times it is people that they know, that they're familiar with, who end up being their traffickers. So they really can target the victims to make them either labor trafficking or sex trafficking. So a lot of times people think it's like someone outside of their community, but in our cases, all of our clients have been trafficked by someone that targeted them in their own community, befriended them and promised them this wonderful job and ended up trafficking them. And what they also do, if they befriended them, they know their families, so that ends up being a huge threat over their heads, that if they don't comply with what the trafficker says, then they're going to hurt their family in their native country.
I'll just add also, one of the points that I think we missed in the earlier panel as far as victimization, which we see both on the domestic side and the foreign national side, is familial trafficking. Often we think of traffickers as some stranger. It's, you know, the image from the movie Taken. But we see quite a bit of familial trafficking. We've also seen cases of where a woman marries someone, plans the marriage abroad, comes here, and then is forced into a labor scenario. And so, in other words, servile marriage situations can also qualify for relief under the immigration laws that we practice under.
I can also add in that I'm speaking in my personal capacity because I jumped in on this panel kind of last minute, and so my comment should be consistent with my employment at Kids in Need of Defense, but didn't 100% get the vetting beforehand, so these are my personal comments. But in terms of my personal experience is that we try to identify children who have been victim of trafficking in terms of their trip from the home country to the United States and thereafter. And so as part of, you know, the intake for children to identify legal remedies, that's part of the questioning, is like, you know, when did you leave, and, you know, what happened during that trip, and what was crossing the border like, and what happened after that. And very recently, different investigations have showed that there are risks also in terms of the process that the children are going through in terms of being placed with individuals after being detained at the border. For the most part, it works well, and we have lots of different success stories, but there are risks. For example, you know, you got to pay the smuggler to come to the United States, and who pays for that? And so there can be situations where that money needs to be paid off, and a child may be told, like, you need to pay rent, or you need to pay this off by working. And so that's something that we have to be aware of. The other situations are, for example, these young girls who come to the United States, and they're right at the time of coming of age, and there can be a lot of challenges in terms of adjustment to home life and a new home, and, you know, parents who may not have seen in 10 years, and they have new U.S. citizen children, and, you know, and they can have some falling out and go to the boyfriend's house or be seduced and vulnerable to seduction by an older person who ends up being a pimp. And not too long ago, I learned of, not everything always goes wrong, but I learned of such a vulnerable situation where a child, I mean, they're still 17 years old, that's a child, you know, who had a falling out with their parent, somehow linked up with some friends and popped up in California. And you just didn't even know where she was for several weeks. And it ends up that she's fine, she's safe, and she's actually being connected for legal remedies and transferring venue and all of these things that you need to do to follow the rules in immigration court procedures. But wow, that's scary. That is really scary. Where was she? Who is she with? What happened during that time? I mean, that's, you know, her parents could not communicate with her, eventually tracked her down through Facebook. I mean, these are scary situations with vulnerable children who still can't speak the language, who, you know, don't have any money, who are dealing with trauma, you know, from their home country, but also difficulties here in the United States where, you know, they don't speak the language. There's, unfortunately, violence in our schools that have come up, and targeting of vulnerable immigrant children with respect to those situations, you know, adapting to home, all of those things add to pre-existing trauma. And so we really have to pay attention. So that's, sorry, I know I'm talking for long, but so that's though where organizations such as Kids in Need of Defense and also other organizations who focus on legal representation for immigrant children is so important when it comes to trafficking. Because first of all, if there are adults in a child's life that are professionals and their job is to monitor where that child is, you already have a better chance that that child is less vulnerable to trafficking. So in the situation where a child actually has an attorney, which is maybe 50% of the time right now in the United States for, I think, 100,000 children, at least that child has an attorney who's checking in with the family, who's monitoring where they are, who's finding out if the contact information is no longer working, and following that child through a process for legal remedy, or at least, through the immigration court part. So that's where I think organizations that focus on legal representation for children are really part of the prevention and monitoring solution.
Thank you.
I just wanted to summarize that I think from what you've heard, there really is no common victim. There's not a specific way of thinking about victims. Some of our clients have been college educated to illiterate. So the pimps know how to target their victims. So I don't want people to think that it's this specific way that people are. I mean, they run from all over. So it's something to keep in mind, and from all over the world.
Thank you. Ms. Welch started to mention one of KIND's focus is identifying legal remedies and connecting clients with those remedies. So what exactly are some of the remedies available for international human trafficking victims?
Well, I can tell you that all three of our organizations do work with trafficking victims for these legal remedies, one of which is what we call a T visa, which happens to be a T, which is nice because it reminds you of trafficking. But the other one is called U visa, which doesn't make you think of anything specific. It involves victims of serious crime. And actually, Morgan is really good at explaining this. I've heard her explain it 500 times.
So when we're looking at a trafficking survivor at the Tahirih Justice Center, we've got kind of 5 forms of relief that we would potentially be working with the survivor on, and any combination of factors might make one of those forms of relief more desirable. The T visa that Brooke mentioned before is very helpful in cases in particular where a victim might be traumatized and not willing or able to cooperate with law enforcement, because unlike the U visa, it actually has a trauma exception built into it. You'd have to document that as an attorney, so you'd get a psych eval or other evidence, but that's helpful. There's also asylum, which I don't know how familiar people in the audience are with that as an immigration form of relief, but that's generally speaking if, for example, we were concerned about the safety of return of a trafficking survivor because their trafficker had networks or ability to harm them back in their home country, so it was no longer safe for them to go home. And there might be some advantage to applying for asylum because, for example, you are able to get work authorization after a certain period of time of a pending application, whereas with the U visa and the T visa, you are not eligible to apply for work authorization until you're granted that relief. There may be other kind of tricks or strategies that you're thinking about, such as family members that are derivatives. So the T visa has one of the most extensive abilities to reach out to and include other family members in the process of all of the forms of immigration relief that we work with. It can include and extend to grandchildren of the primary victim and to siblings, depending on age and types of situations related to those derivatives back home. And so there could be a great advantage to applying for that. The other thing to keep in mind as you're looking at all of these different legal options is access to public benefits. So an asylum seeker has no access to public benefits and no right to any of that relief. Now, a T visa victim victim who is certified then has access to a lot of federal benefits and may be able to get things like cash assistance and job placement training and other benefits that can really help them stabilize as they're waiting for their case to process and penned. And U visas, unfortunately, don't get many or any of that at all. So there might be different reasons.
Visa instead of a T visa.
So as I mentioned before, and I think Amanda highlighted this in the first panel, that the U visa tracks state-based crimes, right? So under Maryland law, our state-based definition of human trafficking differs from the federal definition of human trafficking, and so you might have a scenario in which you may not be able to prove all of the elements of force, fraud, and coercion, but you could potentially raise that trafficking case under the U visa, saying that this is a crime of trafficking and have it certified by a law enforcement official at the state level. So that's a potential or possible workaround. But yeah, there's a whole lot, I think, that goes into considering what types or forms of relief. Brooke can probably speak more extensively to this, but you could certainly, in a case of familial trafficking, make an argument for special immigrant juvenile status. Clearly, one or both parents is not able to protect your child if they are involved in trafficking that child. And so that's another potential form of relief that in some cases can be a more direct or immediate access to a green card than the other forms of relief that I talked about, because they have different waiting periods. So that might be an advantage there on SIDG.
And then I wanted to add with the T visas, they have plenty of numbers. So with the U visa, which is an option, the federal government and the statute states there's only 10,000 issued in a year. So that's across the United States. So right now, our clients are looking at least, I would say, I'm guessing, because we don't really know, at least a 2-year waiting period. Whereas with the T visa, which also gives them work authorization, which is so important for persons who are undocumented, we're getting them like in 6 months. So that person's able to go ahead and start their life and move forward. And then we also, some of them have prostitution charges, so we want to make sure that we get all those off. And then with work authorization, they're able to become more self-sufficient. With our particular clients, all of them have been brought here by their traffickers, and it's really unsafe for them to go back to their town because the trafficker's there or he has friends there, they're threatening their families. So that's why these benefits are so important for victims, so that they can live here safely and be able to also support themselves and their children if they have children.
I think we forgot to mention wait times, processing times. You touched a little bit on that, Suzanne, but that can be a huge determinant when you're looking at different forms of relief, what to file. The U visas, yes, there's a backlog, and we're probably looking at least 2 years before you get a final determination of U visa status. There's interim deferred action. And then the T visas, yes, are processing a bit more quickly. Asylum is pretty backlogged, whether you're in the affirmative process or in immigration court. You're looking at approximately 2 years or more there as well. So I guess in this case, the T visa would be the fastest to process, or special immigrant juvenile status if you were able to quickly get that predicate order in the family court side of things. So that factors in.
Thank you. So, Ms. Bailey, you mentioned one of the obstacles consists of getting rid of their prostitution conviction as an obstacle. Are there any other type of barriers or obstacles that someone face in terms of determining a particular type of remedy that they have access to?
Well, I think Morgan touched on it. Many of the clients have experienced such trauma that it can be difficult for them to communicate with even their advocates. So it's important, if we can, to get them into counseling if that's something they're willing to do. But you're talking about being raped. With our clients, it's sex trafficking. So they're being raped numerous times a day, not a week, numerous times a day. They're also being beaten. They're being threatened. They don't know where they are. They're being moved around. So I think trauma for some of our clients has been a huge obstacle. And just with all trafficking victims, with housing and just getting their needs met, and also language access can be an issue also. If they're not native English speakers, even at hospitals, or if we're trying to get them services, it can be an obstacle.
Thank you, Ms. Weibel or Ms. Welch. Do you have anything else to add to that?
I think that one of the biggest barriers that I feel our clients confront is, I guess it would be a combination of what we would think of in the domestic side of things as victim blaming, and then also the barriers that any immigrant faces when, you know, entering a new community and culture and trying to navigate a complex legal system and all sorts of, you know, really difficult things to figure out, everything from transportation beyond. And that's why, frankly, I think we see such a low volume of cases and low numbers, not because it's not happening, but simply because we can't get to it or people can't get to us for those services. And that may include, you know, when, even though we have task forces that equip and train law enforcement to identify signs of human trafficking, you know, when a victim calls 911 and someone is dispatched, if they are not immigrant friendly or they're not willing to use a language line, they can quickly be shut down and not access any legal services. There may also be all types of other barriers, like Rachel mentioned in the first panel, such as, you know, not trusting the legal system. You know, there's lots of other countries that have incredibly corrupt legal systems and where traffickers may work hand in hand with police forces and military and many government officials. And so it can be incredibly intimidating, I think, and difficult to come forward. And if that first attempt is met with any sort of anti-immigrant sentiment, you know, that's just an incredible barrier to overcome. So I think, all of the traditional barriers that immigrants in this country face and acutely we're aware of today, given the political climate that we're in, are faced by trafficking survivors, but then they have all of these other additional levels of things that trafficking survivors are, you know, makes it challenging for them to really work through the legal system and process. And I think another piece of that too is guilt and shame, right? You know, often that is precisely what the trafficker has identified and targeted and groomed this person to fall in line. You know, you have to work this amount of hours in the nail salon because if you don't, you'll be shamed by your family by being this old and unmarried and not working and not productive. And so there's just a whole lot of like manipulation and shame that's involved in that as well. That becomes a huge barrier and challenge, I think, for survivors.
I think also it's important to just take a step back and recognize that the individuals who are recruited, coaxed, manipulated, force, fraud, coercion, into trafficking are vulnerable individuals to begin with. So, you know, if you have someone who's like strong, well-educated, I know in the movies sometimes it looks like, oh, they could be taken also, but the reality is that, you know, our clients have come from poverty, have come from violence, don't speak English, don't know how to navigate the system, you know, are afraid of authority from their home country, may have disabilities, actual disabilities. I worked with a client who had a disability that completely prevented her from communicating, you know, I won't go into details, but, or the trauma that they've already experienced has disabled them in a way. And in terms of children, there's already, you know, lower legal standards for asylum and other remedies with the recognition that children can't necessarily tell stories in a linear fashion that would make sense to other people. And so there's that obstacle as well. So there's a lot to be on the lookout for.
And two, a lot of the victims, where they're getting their information is from their pimp. So the pimp will say, oh, when the police come, they're going to arrest you, right? Or they're going to deport you. So she already has, I'm going to say she, there are male victims also, but she already has that fear. So if law enforcement comes on the scene and they arrest her for prostitution, then she thinks, oh yeah, that's what the pimp, you know, that's what he said happened, and that is what's happening. So a lot of times their information is coming from him only. You can't trust police, this is what's going to happen. So trying to overcome those barriers, even in communication, can be very difficult.
I think also in particular in this climate where we have very targeted and purposeful raids of immigrant populations, fear of police here in the US is real and tangible and quite logical. So even if it's not that you have some past experience in your home country, you may live down the street from somebody or know someone within your community who has been part of a raid or arrested and put in detention centers, and that's a real fear and a huge barrier, I think, to accessing services and bringing forth your case.
And then the last thing I'll add is also what Morgan said with shame. A lot of the victims' families think they're here having legitimate jobs. So he can threaten that if you don't do what I say, I'm going to tell your family what you're doing here. So there's a lot of shame and guilt, and hoping that they don't find out is what we've had with our clients, because they do know the families. So they just try to portray that they're here, doing the best they can at cleaning or whatever they're doing. So they have also that fear.
Thank you. And I know there's the safe harbor policy, so if you can please discuss with the audience what exactly is the safe harbor policy and how does it help or affect victims of international human trafficking?
I think that probably would have been better posed to the previous panel, because some of those folks are actually intimately involved in that legislation. I can briefly summarize that. Maryland is looking at a safe harbor policy akin to some of the other safe harbor policies throughout the country. In the last legislative session, there was a group of experts that was convened. Some of those are former panelists here that looked at kind of what was the best approach to implementing safe harbor in Maryland. There were various listening sessions throughout the state where they took into consideration different approaches. And my understanding is that there is going to be a push for future legislation to extend that kind of conceptual session of what safe harbor will look like in Maryland in comparison to other states. But generally speaking, it goes along the lines of less kind of criminalization, more treating victims as victims, identifying victims as victims rather than charging them with prostitution, and things along that line of thought and approach. But I can't speak to the details of it here because I wasn't unfortunately involved in any of that. So.
Thank you. So in terms of federal government efforts, do you think that there should be a push for stronger efforts to protect victims of international human trafficking?
Always yes.
And if so, how?
Well, for us, our clients, I think a lot of it's communication and public awareness, that I think governments need to work together to make sure that people are aware of this issue. I know I was in Costa Rica, and there were signs everywhere about human trafficking, everywhere we went. So it's like, I think if people are aware, they may stop and think more about it, and if the governments work together to make sure that we recognize this issue worldwide. And I know Morgan and I were on a panel at the police department. It was the State Department. Visitors from all over the world comparing and what works and what doesn't work. So I think working together to get the best practices is really helpful. The federal government, I think, we work with the FBI, I think we all do, which is one way, but they have victim advocates and working with them more closely to make sure that the victim's needs are addressed. So it can be basic needs. It's great to say to a victim, oh, we want you to get out of the life. So a lot of times sex trafficking is called the life. There's a whole vocabulary. But it's hard to get someone out of the life if you can't help them with shelter, if you can't help them with food, where are they going to sleep tonight, how are they getting medical care, how are they getting mental health counseling. So I think making sure that those first responders are aware, and it could be the FBI under federal law, to make sure those services are available to the victims, because a lot of times victims they can go back because there aren't services available. There's not language, there's not someone there who speaks their language. So just being aware, and like we've said before, treating victims when you first respond, that is such a huge part of whether they're going to come forward, and making sure that they have a safe place to go is one way I would say.
I can add to that. I was going to say, I think before you jump to federal government, I think we have to start with ourselves as individuals and start there. You know, what are we doing to educate ourselves, you know, and our communities? Like, you know, what was really fantastic is that the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force actually had a conference a little over a year ago directed to community members to come in and learn about trafficking, the signs, how to detect it, what to do. Also heard from survivors and their experience. And I think that's really, for me as an advocate, I think it's so important to build our community, you know, starting with as an individual. And then a couple years ago, we actually created our Foreign Nationals Working Group within the Victim Services Committee of the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force. And so today, like so many of us as service providers, we know how to collaborate better, and we know better what the resources are. And, you know, even today, Turnaround, Tahirih, and the Esperanza Center now have a grant under Comprehensive Services to Human Trafficking Victims for the first time ever in the Baltimore area. And that's really huge. And I think it's as a result of us stepping up as service providers, advocates, building relationships, you know, expanding that to actually seeking federal dollars, you know, taking the actions to seek the federal dollars, and then to implement it further in cooperation again, and then reach out from there also to include law enforcement, both in terms of local. So for example, I'm on the Hispanic Advisory Council for the Baltimore City Police Commissioner, and, you know, part of that is, unfortunately, we've had a lot of fear instituted lately, which is really difficult for those of us who have been advocating trust and cooperation with law enforcement over the last several years. But, you know, that's part of it, is having a community and having, you know, individuals be aware so that they can report it, so that they can feel comfortable to report it, you know, within a church to know more about what's going on. And, you know, so because there are brothels disgusting brothels, you know, with Latinas, young girls here in Maryland. And that's part of the collaboration between the federal government, the DHS. We have some fantastic victim services, like Susan Ritter. I know that she wanted to be here today. And we have some amazing people, like in part of Prince George's County law enforcement, and they're part of like a gang task force unit that they work together to identify the gangs, you know, and so I feel like it just, excuse me, expands. It's kind of like the ripple, you know, if you throw a stone, like you just start a ripple effect. So that's what I'd like to communicate.
I think for me, one of my concerns, and I've thought about this a lot because of all of the work that we do on the task force about educating and identifying and flagging victims, is yes, there's a definite need for that. We definitely as a community should be identifying and flagging victims, but if that is on the flip side met with absolutely no services and no resources and no access, then what have we provided to that community? It's like asking people to come out of the shadows and then slamming the door in their faces. And so you know, whether it's the federal government or local government or independent agencies, there are huge gaps in services, in particular for foreign national victims. You know, one of the largest that we've tried to tackle for years on the task force is housing. There are no housing options specifically for survivors of human trafficking. How do you leave a trafficking scenario and have nowhere to sleep that night? Access to mental health services that are culturally competent and linguistically accessible, right? It's really hard to go through therapy in a second or third language. So finding counselors out there that can provide victims with really culturally appropriate services. And then finally, I know this is going to sound kind of strange because the previous panel was so, I guess, not anti-prosecutions, but looking at different options to prosecutions. But I have to say, I have a lot of clients that would love to see their case heard in court. The number of labor trafficking cases prosecuted in this country is frankly embarrassing. Martina Vandenberg has a fantastic study on the number of cases that have been prosecuted with foreign national victims, and she particularly looks at labor trafficking, and there's not a lot of prosecutions out there, and that has a ripple effect as well, because if law enforcement is choosing not to pursue cases, they may also not be willing to certify U visas. I mentioned the T visa exception, but that still has a hurdle and evidentiary burden to overcome, and so it can really have a lot of effects to victims. I think it's wonderful that we're working on educating the community and identifying and flagging things, but we also have to step up the services that we're providing to people. Otherwise, it's just another door slammed in their face.
Ms. Bailey, you had something?
Well, I wanted to add, if you're undocumented, we spoke about this a little bit earlier, but if you're undocumented in this country, you really don't have access to public benefits. So, like Morgan said, if we are asking you to come out, there have to be services, because you may not have work authorization, you can't get a housing voucher, you're not getting food stamps. So those services have to be available. So, that's one way the federal government we need money for housing. There's housing for victims of domestic violence, there's not enough of that, but a lot of times the shelters don't overlap. So we're having difficulty with housing for victims.
Thank you. And this is primarily for Ms. Welch and/or Ms. Bailey. Ms. Weibel mentioned the aspect of there should be prosecution. What are your stands? Do you believe that there should be prosecution, or do you think that there are other alternatives to prosecution? And if so, what possibly are they?
Well, I believe in prosecution myself, and a lot of our clients also want their perpetrators prosecuted. So a lot of times we go by what the client wants. So for instance, I don't assume what my clients want. We ask them specifically. So for example, I don't assume that they want their perpetrators deported or prosecuted. We would ask them, and of course, if so, we will work with the prosecution. We accompany our clients to court and help them as much as we can through the system, because it's a difficult system, right? For law students, how many people go to court and you know exactly what's going on, or what you should be filing, or what a null process or a stat, and think about if this isn't even your first language, English, and you don't understand all of this. So prosecution is important, because pimps need to know, right, that this is not acceptable, and they have to serve time. There's not enough prosecutions of these crimes in general, and it could be, like Morgan said earlier, victim blaming, or she's a prostitute, or this is what she wanted, and things like that. But we need to look at it as the crime it is. It is modern, slavery for sure. A lot of the victims are getting no money at all, none. And the perpetrators, the pimps, are getting all the money. So the gangs now are moving from drug trafficking to human trafficking, because it's a lot easier to, if you're walking down the street with a girl, right, it's not that big of a deal if you're walking through the airport or things like that. And you can, if I'm selling you this bottle of water, it's gone. But if I'm selling you a person, you can sell that person over and over and over again. So the word has to get out that the federal government and local government takes these crimes very seriously. And a lot of times they're going across state lines. So the law enforcement has to work together to make sure that they're prosecuted. But if the services, again, like Morgan said, if you have services for victims, they're going to be better witnesses. They're going to get out of the life. They're going to be able to move forward and come and testify and be willing to work with the prosecutors, because these cases can go on for years. So we need to make sure victims are in good places to be witnesses.
I was going to say, I actually don't have direct experience with the court process in terms of the criminal justice process for human trafficking victims, but I have a lot of experience for victims of other serious crimes. And my personal experience is that people want to follow through. I have an example of a family where the little girl was sexually abused, and that family pursued it, said, what's going on with the investigation? What's going on with the State's Attorney's Office. Why haven't they pursued this yet? And, you know, it took my advocacy to actually get it moving along. And they wanted to pursue it. They wanted to make sure that this abuser was caught. And so just in general, not necessarily trafficking specific, but my experience working with this vulnerable population, predominantly of undocumented immigrants, is that there's a lot of courage and actually a lot of desire to see the criminal justice system through if you have the support, which what's good about specifically the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office is that there is a bilingual victim advocate, which we do not have at the police department level and that we are advocating for. But what I also wanted to add is that there is access to some benefits and work authorization abilities through that criminal justice process. So for example, the Department of Homeland Security can issue what's called continuous presence, and that can include work authorization. It's generally for the pendency of the actual proceeding. Also, I think we briefly mentioned that with the T visa, it does have benefits that other remedies do not have access, and you're actually able to start to access that in terms of housing and some other assistance after you have, we call it certification from HHS, but it's kind of like a prima facie determination of sorts. Tell me if I say that wrong. But so that, luckily, even if you're undocumented, you do have access to that if you pursue the T visa side.
And if I could just add, I hope this isn't getting to your next question ahead of the game on this, but you know, prosecutions in and of themselves are not the answer to everything. I think one of the biggest pieces that it fulfills for a lot of our clients that do choose that they want to go forward with a prosecution, and not everyone universally is interested in that. But I think at the core of what is worthwhile to most survivors is that it gives them a sense of dignity and an understanding that our community and society recognizes the wrong that has been perpetrated against them. And so I think in a world in which we're doing all of this outreach and education to identify and flag and be able to see someone and say that's a trafficking victim, the piece that sometimes kind of gets lost in the mix of that is the real human dignity of the person that is. You know, we talk about them and their vulnerabilities, and there are vulnerabilities, and that is a reality that traffickers use, but let us not get lost in the mix of that these are, you know, impoverished people that have no agency in the world and that are in these terrible situations and just kind of always pitifully look at survivors as that. And so I think part of the legal process is it's bringing the sense of dignity to them that, like, what has been done to you could have been done to any one of us here, and that you know, the force, fraud, and coercion that was perpetrated against you is very logical for any adult mind to follow or go through on. And that's what I think I was trying to get at when I said we need to overcome some of that victim blaming, because often when I go out and do trainings and meet new audiences and talk in the community, people really have a hard time, in particular with this foreign national population, understanding how an adult might be forced to work against their will. Like, employment in the US is voluntary. I would just leave that job if it was terrible. And what they don't understand are all of kind of the underlying pressures and things that a trafficker has done to groom that victim. And so if we could get to a place where there was some alternative to the prosecutions that could dignify people and victims in that way, I think we would really be providing a lot of what survivors are looking for in that realm, because I think that's at the core of what most survivors are looking for. I've never had a client come to me and say, I want to make money off of, you know, the civil case that I'm going to file after this prosecution, or that often they're looking for a validation of what they've experienced as a wrong, and also just avoiding that happening to someone else in the future, right? So.
And I wanted to add, when we, in our office, when we start working with clients, we could work with them for a couple years. It depends on how long their case takes. But usually when they come, we take a picture of them. So this is one of my recommendations when you start practicing, is get a picture of your clients, because sometimes when they come back, you can't remember who they are if you have a high case load, or if you're going to meet someone in court, it's like, oh my gosh, who was that? What does she look like? So we take pictures of our clients. So, when we start talking about their cases, it's like, oh, who was that? Oh yeah, I remember her. So, but what it's really helped us is in the beginning when we take the picture, we have it, and then when they come and get their papers to show that they have status, we take another picture, like their closing picture. And literally what Morgan was saying about dignity, sometimes they look like completely different people. And when I say different people, I mean their hair, their skin, their eyes. Sometimes I don't recognize them. So they're getting their dignity back. And I think another benefit of prosecution is in many of these cases, there's more than one victim. So it's also that they can see that this didn't just happen to me, this happens to other people. And like Morgan said, it could happen to anyone. It's not just a certain type of person. And we don't really even know because so many of them don't come forward. So we don't even really know how many victims are out there.
Thank you. And at this time, I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience.
It's okay.
Hi, I'm not sure if this is on. So my question is, so victims of human trafficking obviously can come from different parts of the world. How do we reconcile cultural barriers in our attempt to combat human trafficking? And an example of that is in Cambodia, it's taboo for victims or anyone to speak out against perpetrators.
So kind of a cultural relativism argument on that. I think, I work at the Tahirih Justice Center. We work in a lot of different cultural areas and practices and norms, and so we get this question quite often. Generally, it comes up in the realm of female genital mutilation, but I think I understand what you're getting at, and that is, how do you kind of accept something that someone might say is a cultural practice and oppose that? And I think the easiest answer to that is I don't have to, because my client is self-identifying, right? So if my client comes forward and says, this is a cultural practice where I come from, but I'm rejecting that and I don't want to take part in it and I don't want to be forced to do any piece in that, then that is absolutely her right to do, and I'm going to support her and fight with her along those lines. So I think that's kind of how you overcome that. I think that culture and religion and all different misinterpretations of those factors have been used in every population and in every religion and in every culture and every tradition to justify violence and human rights violations, and that is a misinterpretation generally of those. If you speak to religious scholars, that is just an interpretation of what the text looks like. If you speak to elders about traditions, it may be a misinterpretation. So, I think we have to tread very lightly and carefully when we're looking at cultures, because I don't believe that it's culturally sensitive to simply say that's a cultural practice and so it should be accepted and tolerated everywhere in the world. I mean, there are some certain core human rights violations that globally we agree upon, and trafficking happens to be one of those, right? So I think in this realm, it's probably the clearest area.
And then I would add, many of our clients are here, maybe they came on their own because they don't want those typical cultural beliefs. They want something different. And so like Morgan said, they come to us, so they're coming to us for help. So of course, their case, how they want to proceed is always up to them. It's their choice. But usually they want something different than what they've had in their homeland, or what their families have told them they should do. So they're moving forward to do something different than what they would be forced to do in many cases in their home country. I mean, they're here for a reason because they want more self-autonomy and legal rights for themselves.
I was going to say, just on the humbling side, is that we're just always learning. Mm-hmm. I was not born with an encyclopedia of, how to communicate with people from across the world. Luckily, I've traveled and lived in a number of countries so that I've kind of developed an ability to have, an openness and a curiosity and a willingness to learn. And a lot of these areas, that's just what we need. We develop country conditions as part of our applications for legal remedies because we need to educate. We need to educate the adjudicators about what's going on in the country and why this person falls within these issues and how they may be different. For example, the disabled client that I worked with, made her special in terms of the services available for her in her home country. The other thing I just wanted to really briefly say is that interpreters are, a key issue. There are a couple indigenous languages from Central America that we have to use a language line or find a volunteer, but you have to be really careful that that volunteer is not intermixed with the same community. It can't be a family or friend, or you don't want rumors to get out. And the other thing, though, is learning over time local lingo, even for interpreters that are constantly learning. We have like this, whole list of terms that children from Central America use as their slang that we provide to our volunteer interpreters, because who's going to know that automatically if you learn Spanish in Venezuela or Chile or Spain? Like, you need to learn those words. I need to learn those words. I'm still learning, but those are issues. But it's an ongoing education and effort of open-mindedness and willingness, I think.
And then along those lines, I would like to add that many of our clients are illiterate in their own language. So it's something, if you start working with the population, to make sure you know whether they are literate in their native language, because many of our clients are not.
Thank you. Robin, you had your hands up, and Harrington, last two, if you still have your questions.
I guess I'll go first because I have the microphone. So my question is this. I remember, Miss Bailey, you said that it was a good thing that we prosecute pimps and to the fullest extent, and I think everyone would agree with that. And I remember, Miss Welch, you also said that the victims themselves often want to go through these prosecutions to find the measure of closure and all that. But in the previous panel, there was posed the example of unfortunately common example of the bottom girl, who is both a victim and a pimp. In fact, the bottom girl can be the one who's doing all the beatings, all the solicitations, perpetrating all the abuse, and while being a victim at the same time. And for that reason, prosecution for her, it's not a, it's hard to prosecute the pimp and not prosecute her too, and no one wants to prosecute her because she's a victim too. So that was the essential, the real dilemma, and I feel like we missed it. So I want to bring it here, and I want to hear what.
It is a real dilemma. I mean, it is a real dilemma. So is everybody familiar with the bottom girl? Yeah. So I guess the question is for law enforcement is, when does the bottom girl, or if the bottom girl goes from victim to perpetrator? That's the question. So many times the bottom girl could be the one transporting the other victims and taking the money and things like that, because when law enforcement rolls up, who's going to be there? The bottom girl, right? The pimp's not there. So she's going to take the whole case right there. So, but if you hear from bottom girls, or a lot of them, they don't have a choice in that matter. So they're either going to be responsible for the girls, and if somebody falls out of line and the bottom girl doesn't address it, then she's going to have to address it with the pimp. The pimp is going to address it with her. So I think it is a huge dilemma for law enforcement on if the bottom girl is a victim, or now has she become a perpetrator. And I guess it's a case-by-case factual basis is what I would think. I mean, because we want to make sure that a victim is treated as a victim. I mean, for sure.
I'm going to disclaim this as my own personal opinion. It is neither the Tahirih Justice Center's or the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force's opinion, but I think that you can simultaneously be a victim and a perpetrator of a crime. So I don't see there being a line where you go from victim to perpetrator. I think it's a lot blurrier than that. I think you can continue to be victimized. People are forced to commit crimes under duress, and I think that's why we need laws like vacatur to recognize that.
I don't have anything to add.
The safe side, huh?
Yeah.
There's a lot of discussion on this very topic.
Right, as we speak, probably.
And Robin, last question.
I'm just wondering about resource allocation for this. I believe you're all private organizations, so do we get grants from state or federal money for this? And then what would be the wait time, or how much of a demand for your services is there that isn't presently being able to be met?
I think we all probably are federal, state, and privately funded.
Yep.
And then I would say the demand for human trafficking, like we said, a lot of victims don't come forward. I mean, we know that there's a higher demand than we're hearing from victims, but I guess the issue that we're having with resources is, like what we said, housing and things like that are the main issues with resources. I would say that I think with legal services, we could handle more clients. I don't know about everyone else, but.
Can I make a pitch, knowing the audience that we're in front of? A fantastic EJW fellowship or, Skadden fellowship, should you want to go into the realm of human trafficking, would be to try to provide some sort of brief advice and counsel, like within 24 hours, 72 hours of recovery. I think what we hear repeatedly from our colleagues at HSI is that there may be foreign national victims that are recovered in a scenario of human trafficking or raid, and most folks choose to go home or disperse and aren't connected up with service providers because they don't know their legal rights under the law, and law enforcement doesn't feel like they're in a position to tell the person about those legal rights, nor are they probably the right agency or person to share that information with someone who's trying to assess their options. So I think, there's demand for services. Sure. I think there's probably a lot more foreign national trafficking victims out there that could be connected up with service providers and receive services if there was somebody that was making that quick connection of know your rights under the law. So for anyone who wants a fellowship, please talk to us.
I have some things to add. In terms of kids in need of defense, nationally, we received significant funding recently through Vera Institute of Justice to significantly expand our services, in recognition that in 2014 there was a huge surge of unaccompanied children coming from Central America and crossing the border down in Southwest United States, and then joining family members or friends or family members throughout the country. And Maryland has, I think it's like the 5th largest population of unaccompanied minors per capita, so it's really a significant role in this situation. And so kind actually just expanded from 30 national employees to 110. And our Baltimore office expanded from 2 just 2 years ago to officially 13 as of yesterday. So my position is actually new in terms of having an additional pro bono coordinating attorney. And in terms of how we do things, we actually get referrals directly from service providers that are affiliated with the shelters that the children come through. And you know what, we want to serve as many children as we can, but that's the whole point, is that we can't do everything. Even, the combination of every single organization that's trying to provide legal services or facilitate it through pro bono attorneys, which we can always use your help, by the way, You know, we're only scratching the surface. There's only, I think, 50, the numbers that I have right here is that it says about half of the more than 100,000 unaccompanied children who came to the U.S. in the past 2 years do not have representation. So we get cold calls and we say, if we can, we'll help you, but we already have our, even with our massively expanded staff, you know, we've got our plates full. But what I wanted to throw in also is that in terms of, you know, helping, detecting, I've already mentioned the key potential and actuality of legal representation for these children in terms of monitoring their safety. Not only just getting through the immigration court procedure and potential humanitarian remedies, but actually monitoring, where are they? Are they still there? Are they safe? You know, because these children have already been victims of certain crimes, like sexual abuse in their home country, because they were already abused, abandoned, or neglected. And unfortunately, that makes them vulnerable here as well, including, you know, the living situations, like you may have a male house member who, you know, takes advantage of the vulnerability of a girl living in the same house. And that girl has already been sexually abused in home countries. So there is new legislation proposed called the Fair Day in Court for Kids Act. And it's pending right now. It was actually introduced. There's like all sorts of people involved, but basically it's Fair Day in courts. And the idea is that these children should not, as 3 or 4-year-olds, need to be learning how to represent themselves in immigration court. You know, the idea is that, you know, though it may be expensive, that these children should have an attorney. You know, half of them should not be trying to navigate this complex immigration system without an attorney. So you can actually look into, you know, depending on, you know, what you're comfortable with, but, you know, there is, you know, legislative advocacy that can be done and pending legislation right now.
Thank you. And that concludes our discussion on human trafficking, but this is just the end of our formal discussion. I do encourage you to continue to have these conversations with your peers and families, as education and awareness is one step in the right direction of combating human trafficking. So at this time, we would like to thank our panelists as well.
Thank you to our moderator as well.
Thank you.